Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by former Deputy Director of National Intelligence Sue Gordon and Admiral Mike Mullen, formerly Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're going to be talking about the U.S. and Taiwan based on a bipartisan independent task force report that they chaired from the Council on Foreign Relations, which has just been released. Welcome to Admiral Mullen and to Sue Gordon. Good to have you.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you.
Hi, David. Great to see
you. Let's jump in, and I'm going to ask Sue to set the stage as we start. Sue, the United States has supported since 1972 what we call the One China policy, which has been ambiguous about the ultimate status of China, how it would be become one country. But your report says that long-standing status quo is now threatened. And I want to ask you to explain to our audience why that is. What's changed?
So I think you're right on the top line. You'd have to argue that the fact that we've had peace suggests that our policy has been successful at that level. But I think when we look at the situation, not only what's going on globally, where Taiwan's mindset is, but most explicitly where China is going, I think you see that deterrence that has been so successful seems to be eroding. And when you look at China, I think there are four things. Number one is Xi's statements all on his own. He has been very clear that reunification is an important element of his legacy, one that he doesn't believe can be passed on. The second is just his investment in his military and direct statements that his military needs to be ready by 2027. And again, I'm not saying 2027 is any magical date, but it is an intention that his military needs to be ready. I think their broad global expansionism, particularly in the South China Sea, is another example. And then finally, just their coercive acts against Taiwan that I think suggest that what has held is being marginalized or minimized over time. And that creates the potential that if we don't attend to it, you could find yourself in a situation that's unimaginable, which would be war on with China over Taiwan.
Mike, I want to turn to you with this question about the failure of the status quo, and particularly the failure of deterrence. Do you take the argument that Xi is preparing, has instructed the PLA to be prepared to attack Taiwan by 2027 seriously as a plausible threat that he could actually deliver?
I think, David, what's different is Xi's outward statements, very, very different from his predecessors. So, as Sue has outlined, he's been very clear that he can't pass this on. He's told his military to be ready by 27, et cetera. And so you have to take it very seriously. And he's backed that up with, I think, a tremendously coercive set of actions from the military standpoint, whether it's the kind of flights, in and around Taiwan or the blockade type exercises. I mean, the message is loud and clear. The other really important part of the status quo discussion is how the context has changed in Taiwan itself. Far removed from the 70s, as you suggested, when this policy went into place, the Taiwanese people are much more focused and supportive of democracy in their future. They have a booming economy centered on the semiconductor industry, which is really the center mass of semiconductors for the world, not just in the region or for the U.S. And China. And I think we have to take that very much into consideration. And then lastly, they've looked at what happened in Hong Kong, where there was going to be, one country, two systems, and that's sort of gone by the wayside. So the message from China is very clear and the context of what's happened in terms of deterrence, which has worked so far, has dramatically changed.
So, Mike and Sue both, an audience member of ours, Faye Kleeman, who's from Colorado, poses the basic question in the starkest terms. She asks, will China invade Taiwan? If so, when and how? Just on that very direct question, what would be your answers? Let me ask Sue to start.
Yeah, I'll say the only person that knows the answer to that question is she, right? And so the question is, and really the problem that we're addressing is, how do you affect that calculus, right? So far, he has decided not to. We want to keep that decision in place. His action suggests that he is readying so that he could decide. By no means is it a sure thing. A military action against Taiwan is not easy, and I'll have Mike talk more about that. He certainly looked at what was happening in Ukraine and has considered how difficult that has been for Russia, and then trying to put that in his own situation. But I will say that we don't know when or if he will decide. What we do know is that he is acting as though he is moving closer to the ability to do it. And our interest is in the United States and Taiwan and our allies trying to create the condition that that isn't a decision he makes today.
Mike, the Chinese famously, quoting their strategist Sun Tzu 2,500 years ago, like to win wars without fighting. Why on earth would she invade across the Strait of Taiwan in what would be a bloody disaster for China? Is that really realistic?
Well, it's the toughest military operation I'm aware of, is to have an amphibious landing, and that is one part of at least what we think from a possible scenario would occur. At some point in time, he'd have to go ashore. I think his current strategy is to try to put so much pressure on Taiwan that they sort of put their hands up and say, "Okay, we'll come aboard." But that's increasingly challenging for him because of what I said before in terms of the Taiwanese people supporting democracy. I think part of it, as Sue said before, is his legacy. He's very clear in that regard that he wants to resolve this. Most assessments indicate that his military isn't ready to do that yet. That said, this isn't just about Xi Jinping. I think any Chinese leader, if they think they're going to lose Taiwan, would resort to force to make sure that didn't happen. And certainly Xi Jinping is at the top of the list with respect to that. That's why being strong, both internally in Taiwan from a defense standpoint, in terms of as well as our support and our ally support, to make sure that any given day Xi is deterred and knows that he can't win it if he tries to take Taiwan by force.
So I want to ask you both about a core strategic question that your task force looked at, but you say you were unable to reach consensus about, and that's the question of whether we should maintain what's called the policy of strategic ambiguity, where we never quite say that we would be prepared to come to Taiwan's defense. President Biden has made statements, but they're quickly adjusted afterwards, so as to preserve this ambiguity. Or instead, we should move to a policy of strategic clarity, where we make clear if China attacks Taiwan, we will come to Taiwan's defense, much as we've pledged to do with Japan and South Korea. I know that your group as a whole wasn't able to reach a consensus. I wonder if each of you would be willing to say what your own view is on which course is wisest. Let me ask Mike to start.
I'm not sure. I think the fact that we couldn't and didn't come to consensus is instructive, David. My own position on that, and this comes out of visiting Taiwan a year ago, March, that ambiguity has worked very well, and there's no incredibly clear indication that we should change that policy at this particular point in time. I worry, quite frankly, that if we move to strategic clarity, we actually move closer to the possibility of war. And that's just my personal view. I also think the policy discussion with respect to this is probably a little bit overhyped in terms of making a difference one way or another. One of the reasons I think that this study is so important is there's a lot of information about this incredibly complex situation embedded in the study itself that even I didn't understand, because when I was serving, I was focused on obviously the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's a great deal to be learned about the history here, the current situation, and I just didn't think the decision with respect to this policy was that compelling one way or another.
Yeah,
Let me just underline what Admiral Mullen, Sue, I'll turn to you in a minute just to underline what Admiral Mullen said. This report is unusual in just how detailed and helpful it is in thinking about the basics. Sue, what about that basic question? Do you think strategic clarity would provide greater deterrence, or is it a mistake?
So my opinion, a lot like Mike, comes from a recent visit I made to Taiwan and talking to their leaders. And I think I was maybe surprised. We asked the question directly about, is strategic ambiguity still working, or is strategic clarity the right answer? And their answer, at least to us, was I would say the words aren't as important as being clear with your actions on specific areas, being clear with us, being clear with the allies, being clear even with China diplomatically on the one side of policy. So I think it has worked, as Mike said. I do think what you got in the report with our specificity was trying to take U.S. interests and being sure that we were not being unclear about those interests and what our actions would be around them. Mike and I have talked about this, and the whole group did, is any change from the path we're on is probably going to increase some friction. But there are sets of things that we believe needed to be done, not necessarily confronting the issue directly, but ensuring that all the members of this triumvirate, and even beyond that with our allies, are well positioned against their interests.
So I'm told that when U.S. diplomats, national security officials meet with senior Chinese officials and state that we continue to abide by the one China policy, their response is that they think that we're hollowing out that policy. We still say the words, but we don't really mean them so much anymore. We arm Taiwan. We have growing bipartisan support for Taiwan and even Taiwanese independence among some members of Congress. So what do you think? How would you answer that Chinese criticism made to Jake Sullivan and Secretary Blinken? Your one China policy is hollowed out. It's not real. How would you answer that?
I'm always very hesitant to assume that I know what someone else is thinking. I can see how some actions would make them believe that what the U.S. intentions are different from perhaps what we're saying. But I also think that's a pretty convenient statement for them to make as a way to govern our actions, to keep the advantage in their court. And we haven't even, and to keep us on the back foot, not commenting about their actions that actually are increasing the tensions, are actually moving toward a non-peaceful outcome. That I think when they pressure us and make statements about what we're doing, it is in a way to deflect against their actions and to keep us in a smaller box than perhaps we need to be.
Good point. They do seem to have us bargaining with ourselves, as people often are able to do. Mike, one of the fascinating things about this report is that it includes additional views from a number of your fellow task force members. And I was struck by one in particular I wanted to ask you about. Two of your panel members argue in these additional views that the U.S. should alleviate Chinese anxieties about Taiwan by signaling that it's prepared to accept a peaceful unification eventually, if that's what China and Taiwan want, and that it wouldn't rule out future dialogue with China about options for the future of Taiwan. What do you think of that argument that we can maybe deter and deflect China by talking to them?
Well, I think, I mean, first of all, this is Taiwan, I think, is the central issue between China and the United States. One. Two, the two leaders, the two presidents have to discuss and guide us in this. If we just leave it up to the staffs, if you will, I think we will continue on this road that the phrase I've used is drifting into war. So it is absolutely critical. We say in the report that Taiwan is a vital strategic interest. It is also, I think, imperative that our president educate Americans about why this is so important. When you have democracy and freedom threatened there, and if we were to make a decision to go to war to support Taiwan, that's something the American people have to be very much in favor of in that regard. Your question actually focuses on what we say in the report is we're very supportive of the one China policy that seeks a peaceful resolution to this cross-strait issues. And that's what we want to do. Again, leaders have to do that. And then lastly, I would just say this, it goes back to the status quo. Part of what we have to do with our allies, quite frankly, is take steps to improve deterrence and show strength because China has been so coercive in the diplomatic arena, in the economic arena, in the military arena as well with respect to Taiwan. That has to be rebalanced in order to have a status quo to get to the peaceful reunification prospect, if you will, to be resolved by the Taiwanese people and by China.
Sue, I want to ask you to comment about what's been in the headlines recently. Secretary Blinken's trip to Beijing, the first trip by a Secretary of State in 5 years, which followed what apparently was a very positive meeting that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had with Wang Yi, the top Chinese diplomat in Vienna a month before. So we seem to be on the road toward what you could call a kind of reset with China, resuming the idea not simply of dialogue, but cooperation on issues of mutual interest, on the road toward a Xi visit to San Francisco, probably in November. You could say on the road toward a reduction in tensions, some de-escalation in the relationship. Does that seem like the right course to you? And do you think China can be believed in some of these professions of willingness to have dialogue?
Well, I think I think it's a good thing. Talking is a good thing. Peace is a good thing. War with China over Taiwan is so bad, not only in terms of lives, any lives lost, but just the global economic impact would be massive. It would make the pandemic impact seem like a speed bump comparatively. So diplomatic outreach, conversation, trying to reduce tensions are all good things. As I say, part of this is just to forestall any decision so we can keep on working on the conditions is good. I do think, and one of the things I hope the listeners hear is that this will not be a straight line progression, right? Even when we have more diplomatic relations, there will be some action we take. For example, if the administration were to follow through on one of our recommendations of bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan, I can absolutely imagine there would be some visit canceled or some counter positioning. So great that we're on this path. I think it is an important element of any deterrent strategy. The American people should not overreact to negative statements along that path because they are going to happen. And again, to keep an eye on what our vital national interests are and not give those up along the way.
One of the interesting statements in your report is that I'm quoting here: the U.S. should avoid symbolic, political, and diplomatic gestures that provoke a Chinese response but do not meaningfully improve Taiwan's defensive capabilities, unquote. Forgive me for being blunt. That sounds like a perfect description of former Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. It was a symbolic action that I think most analysts would say left Taiwan in a weaker position than it was. So, Mike, let me be blunt. If Speaker Pelosi had come to you before that trip and asked, should I do this, what would you have told her?
Well, I think that is the intent. And while Speaker Pelosi actually has long standing with respect to China, and particularly with respect to human rights, meaning she's been all over them since Tiananmen Square. So I'm not sure it was as symbolic as it stated, but clearly that kind of visit, as well as the visit with Speaker McCarthy, though it were here by Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan. They oftentimes they just stir up the rhetoric and they get in the way of making any progress. And so we'd like to see that basically go away, and that these issues be worked, behind closed doors in a quiet way where people would not be embarrassed, and we could actually, make some progress. And so that's one of the reasons that and I think we had consensus across the board with the individuals who are on this task force with respect to that.
So would you, as a former senior intelligence officer, have told the speaker, Madam Speaker, don't do it, not good?
I think I am even stronger now, given where we see the situation is. We will probably create friction with any action. Make sure that friction is worth some viable, tangible strengthening of either the relationship, the resilience, or the deterrence. And if it isn't doing one of those, then I would stay away from it because it's just a bit too hot to be making gestures that don't have specific outcome.
That's helpful. So let me turn to a part of the report that I found especially provocative, but also somewhat troubling. Again, I'm going to quote specifically from the report. You argue that the U.S. should place the U.S. defense industrial base on a wartime footing now to ensure that the U.S. military has the capabilities it needs to deter Chinese aggression. I read that and I thought, really? That sounds to me like a recipe for war. If I was sitting in Beijing and I saw the U.S. put its defense industrial base on a wartime footing, I'd think, well, they're going to war. That's what they're doing. So why is that a good idea? Let me start with Mike and then ask Sue to answer the same question.
I think what that really gets at is how far behind we have been in supplying the kind of support in from the weapon standpoint with respect to Taiwan over the years is one. Secondly, they're basically supplied weapons through what we call the FMS system, which is a very difficult, slow, bureaucratic acquisition system. And my own view on this, David, is, and there is, as we've became much more aware during the pandemic, the Defense Production Act, which allows the president to put the defense industry on a wartime footing, quote unquote, in order to produce much more quickly and cut through an awful lot of the bureaucracy and produce output very quickly, which is what we need. I would much rather have this discussion before conflict broke out in terms of becoming much stronger and having much more of an impact from a deterrent standpoint than I would, okay, now war has started, let's enact the Defense Production Act to make sure that we can catch up. There's certainly risk associated with that. I think there's increased risk almost with any step you take with respect to Taiwan. But the whole message is we've got to get the defense system, the defense industry, moving much more quickly to support the contingencies that are out there in the Western Pacific with respect to Taiwan. And it is mostly to ensure that we're strong and that we can deter the war that we don't want to have.
Sue, do you have any concerns about the signals that putting us on a wartime footing would send it to China and the way in which that could increase the likelihood of conflict?
I have no doubt, as Mike does, that those actions would be seen and they would be reflected back to us exactly as you say, David. But I think Mike said it so well and so eloquently. I'll be more simplistic because that's the way I roll, and that is, if it came to conflict today, we would wish that we had done everything in our power to be ready. And so I think that this is why you have to have the diplomatic relations. You have to have Taiwan making some decisions for itself, and you have to work with our allies and partners, because we may hope that conflict doesn't happen, but boy, if it comes to that, we will want to have done everything in our power to be prepared.
It's well said. I'm going to close with a quick question. We only got less than 2 minutes. It's a big question, but quick answers. So what do each of you think the Ukraine war has done to impact President Xi's thinking about Taiwan? Mike, let me ask you to start.
Sobering. Obviously, lots of people from the Taiwan perspective, in one way, a reminder that it's great when people stand up to fight for their country. It's also encouraging that other countries would show up and support. China hasn't been in a war since the 50s. War never goes as predicted. So in that regard, it's dangerous and I think very instructive.
Sue, what do you think Xi's takeaway from Ukraine is?
Exactly that. I don't know if he ever thought it would be easy. He is certainly well aware of the strengths and less so of his military forces, how complex that would be. And then he looks at Ukraine, which many would have thought would have been a relatively simple operation for Russian forces, and look what it's turned into. So I think it is sobering is a great word, Mike. I would say, man, it gives you pause. And I would expect to see redoubling of his own internal efforts to try and overcome some potential weaknesses that he has in his own fighting force.
Great conversation. Again, I would urge our viewers to take a look at this report. They can find it from the Council on Foreign Relations, a task force on what arguably is our country's most important foreign policy challenge going forward. Thanks to Admiral Mike Mullen and to Sue Gordon, former Deputy Director of National Intelligence, for joining us. Thanks for being with us.
Great.
Thanks, David.
So please come back and join us at WashingtonPost.live. You can go online and see the programs we've got coming. We hope to see you back here soon. Thanks for joining us today.